The day my son left me at the nursing home, he kissed my forehead and said, "It's only temporary, Mom." But when I called him 3 days later, my number had already been blocked. I sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a room that smelled like bleach and loneliness, staring at 2 suitcases that held the remains of my entire life. After 40 years of raising Jack alone, after every double shift, every unpaid bill, every sacrifice, my own son had abandoned me like unwanted furniture. What Jack didn't know was that I still controlled every dollar of the Hamilton family inheritance, and before this story ended, I was going to give it all to a stranger. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, I'd really like to hear your story tonight. And if you're listening from somewhere out there, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. These late-night conversations mean more to me than you know. And if stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing these moments together. I used to believe there was no pain worse than losing my husband. Then my own son abandoned me while I was still alive. Jack Hamilton had once been the center of my entire world. When he was little, he followed me around our tiny kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, clutching the hem of my apron while I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He used to tell people I was his hero. Every Mother's Day card he made in elementary school said the same thing in crooked handwriting: "My mom is the strongest person I know." Back then, I believed nothing could come between us. But somewhere along the way, success changed him. Or maybe money did. After my husband Robert passed away 12 years ago from a heart attack, Jack became obsessed with building a better life. Those were his exact words. He moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, started working in corporate finance, bought expensive watches, joined a country club, and married a woman named Vanessa, who looked at me like I was something outdated sitting on a thrift store shelf. Vanessa always smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I was imagining things. But little comments began slipping through the cracks. "You know Jack worries about you living alone. That house is way too big for one person. Retirement communities are actually very luxurious now." Every sentence sounded polite on the surface, but underneath it I could hear the real message clearly. "You're inconvenient." The hardest part was watching Jack slowly agree with her. The same boy who once cried when I had the flu now forgot to call me for weeks. The same son who used to beg me not to work late started acting irritated whenever I talked too long on the phone. At Thanksgiving the year before, I remember sitting at their dining table while Vanessa showed off her renovated kitchen to guests. Jack barely looked at me all evening. At one point, I accidentally dropped my fork because my arthritis was acting up. The room went quiet for a second before Vanessa forced a laugh and said, "Maybe it's time we start thinking about safer living arrangements for Sienna." Safer living arrangements, like I wasn't even sitting there. Jack didn't defend me. He just stared down at his wine glass. That silence hurt more than the words. Still, I kept making excuses for him. He's stressed. He works hard. He doesn't mean it. That's what mothers do. We protect our children long after they stop protecting us. 3 months before he left me at Rosewood Senior Living Center, Jack started calling more often than usual. At first, I thought maybe he missed me. Now I realize he was preparing me. He asked questions about my medications, my insurance, my mobility, how often I forgot things. It didn't feel loving anymore. It felt investigative. One afternoon, he drove down to Savannah unexpectedly. Vanessa stayed behind, which honestly relieved me. Jack walked through my house slowly studying everything. The old piano, the family photographs, Robert's workshop in the garage. I caught him staring at the framed deed to the house hanging in my office. "You should let me help manage things," he said casually. I laughed softly. "Manage what? The property? Your accounts? It's a lot for someone your age." Someone your age. I noticed how easily he said it, like I had transformed from his mother into a problem to solve. "I'm doing just fine," I told him. His jaw tightened for a second before he forced a smile. I'm just trying to help. But I knew my son. I knew every expression on his face. And that smile wasn't concern. It was frustration. Things got worse after I slipped on my porch steps during a rainstorm and sprained my ankle. It wasn't even serious, but Jack reacted like I had become completely helpless overnight. Suddenly, he insisted on hiring caregivers I never asked for. He called constantly to check in. Vanessa started emailing brochures for assisted living communities. One brochure had a handwritten note attached. This place has a beautiful garden and memory care support, memory care. As if they were already preparing for me to disappear mentally. I cried after reading that note. Not because I was afraid of aging, but because I realized my son had already started erasing me. The final betrayal came on a Tuesday morning. Jack picked me up and told me we were going to tour a rehabilitation center temporarily while my ankle healed completely. I trusted him. God help me, I still trusted him. When we arrived at Rosewood Senior Living Center, the receptionist greeted Jack by name. That was the first moment my stomach dropped. You've already been here? I asked. Jack avoided my eyes. We just wanted to make sure it was nice for you. We, meaning him and Vanessa. The room they showed me was small, clean, cold, a twin bed, one dresser, one window overlooking a parking lot. I remember turning to Jack slowly and whispering, "How long am I staying here?" "Just until things settle down." "What things?" He sighed heavily like I was exhausting him. "Mom, you can't live alone anymore. You didn't even ask me. We're trying to do what's best." No, they were doing what was easiest. There's a difference. I begged him not to leave me there. That's the part I still have nightmares about. A 65-year-old woman standing in a pale hallway pleading with her own son while nurses pretended not to listen. "Please, Jack," I whispered. "I want to go home." He rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Mom, stop making this harder than it needs to be." Harder. My entire life was collapsing in front of me, and to him it was paperwork. When he finally walked away, he didn't look back. Not once. For 3 days, I kept telling myself he would return, that this was all a misunderstanding. Then, on the 4th morning, I opened my email. There was a message from my bank. "Your mailing address has been updated." I stared at the screen in confusion. The new address wasn't my house. It was Rosewood Senior Living Center. Below that was another notification. Jack Hamilton had been added as an authorized contact on several financial accounts. My hands started shaking. That's when I understood the truth. This wasn't temporary. My son had been planning this for months. And for the first time in my life, I felt something inside me break completely. Not grief, not sadness. Something colder. Something dangerous. Because the moment Jack decided I was no longer useful, I stopped feeling guilty about what I was about to do next. The worst part about betrayal is that it rewrites your memories. After Jack left me at Rosewood, I couldn't stop replaying his childhood in my mind like old home movies that no longer made sense. I would lie awake at night, staring at the water-stained ceiling above my bed, asking myself the same question over and over again. When did my son stop loving me? At Rosewood, nights were the hardest. During the day, there were activities and nurses moving through the hallways and televisions humming in the background. But at night, the silence became unbearable. You could hear distant coughing through the walls. Sometimes someone cried out in their sleep. Sometimes an ambulance arrived just before dawn. The place smelled permanently of disinfectant and overcooked vegetables. I hated it, but more than anything, I hated the feeling of being forgotten. Jack only called once during my first 2 weeks there. Once. And even that conversation felt rushed. "How are they treating you?" he asked distractedly. I could hear keyboard typing in the background. "Jack," I said carefully, "when can I come home?" There was a pause, then a sigh. "We've talked about this, Mom." No, we hadn't. He had decided. I had simply been informed. "I miss my house," I whispered. "You need professional care now." Professional care. As if love itself had become unqualified. I looked around my tiny room while he spoke. My entire life had been reduced to a dresser drawer and 2 framed photographs. One picture was of Jack, at age 7, grinning with missing front teeth while holding a fishing pole beside his father. The other was our last Christmas together before Robert died. Sometimes I stared at those photos for hours, trying to figure out where everything went wrong. Because I hadn't been a perfect mother. But I had been a devoted one. When Jack was 9 years old, he got pneumonia during one of the coldest winters Savannah had seen in decades. I remember sleeping upright in a hospital chair for 3 nights straight because he cried whenever I left the room. I remember feeding him ice chips with trembling hands. I remember praying to God to let me suffer instead of him. When his father lost his construction business during the recession, I worked double shifts at a diner for almost 2 years. My feet used to bleed through my shoes by the end of those weekends. Jack never saw that part. I made sure he didn't. All he saw was a mother who somehow still packed his lunches with handwritten notes inside. "You're going to do great on your test. Love you forever. Proud of you." I spent my entire life making sure my son never felt alone. And somehow, I ended up alone anyway. One afternoon at Rosewood, I sat near the courtyard fountain wrapped in a thin cardigan, while another resident named Gloria shuffled beside me with her walker. Gloria was 82 and had bright red lipstick smeared slightly outside her lips every single day. Her children never visited either. "They always leave us in places like this when we become inconvenient," she said suddenly. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She snorted bitterly. "Old people remind the young that time wins in the end." Her words stayed with me. Because deep down, I knew Jack didn't just see weakness when he looked at me. He saw responsibility, expense, burden, and maybe worst of all, mortality. I think Vanessa encouraged those feelings. Not openly. She was too polished for that. But there were moments I couldn't ignore, like the time I overheard her talking in their kitchen last spring. Jack had stepped outside to answer a phone call while I was carrying dessert plates toward the sink. Vanessa didn't realize I was still nearby. "You can't keep driving to Savannah every other weekend," she whispered sharply. "Your mother is draining you emotionally." "She's alone," Jack answered quietly. "She's always going to be alone unless you set boundaries." Boundaries. That word echoed in my head for months. I had carried that boy inside my body for 9 months. I had raised him alone after Robert died. I had sold my wedding jewelry to help pay for his college tuition. And now, I was something he needed boundaries from. At Rosewood, I started noticing how many residents stared at the entrance doors. Every evening around visiting hours, faces would light up hopefully whenever footsteps echoed through the lobby. Then slowly dim again. That kind of disappointment changes people. Some became angry. Some became silent. Some simply stopped expecting anyone at all. I promised myself I would never become one of those women waiting endlessly at windows. So after the 3rd week without a visit from Jack, I stopped calling him. If my son wanted distance so badly, I would give it to him. But emotionally detaching from your child feels unnatural. It's like trying to tear your own skin apart. One rainy afternoon, I finally gathered the courage to ask the front desk for access to my financial records. The young receptionist smiled politely while handing me a tablet. That's when I discovered something else. Several automatic payments connected to my house had already been rerouted through Jack's management system. Management system. The phrase itself made me sick. I scrolled further and saw maintenance requests filed under his name. Property consultations, real estate inquiries. My chest tightened. Jack wasn't just planning my future. He was planning my absence. That night, I barely slept. I kept remembering a conversation Robert and I once had years ago while sitting on our back porch swing. Jack had just graduated college. "He's ambitious," Robert said proudly. "He gets that from you," I teased. Robert became quiet for a moment. "Promise me something, Sienna. What if success ever changes him? Don't ignore it." At the time, I laughed. Because what mother imagines her own child becoming a stranger? But now, lying awake in that cold room, I realized Robert had seen something long before I did. The next morning, I finally listened to the voicemail Jack had left 3 days earlier. "Hey, Mom. Sorry I've been busy. Vanessa and I are looking at some options for the house. Nothing decided yet. Just trying to stay ahead of things. The house. Not your house. Not home. Just an asset." I replayed the message 4 times. By the end, my hands were shaking so hard, I nearly dropped the phone. That house wasn't just property. Robert built the back deck with his own hands. Jack learned to ride a bike in that driveway. Every birthday, every Christmas, every family dinner lived inside those walls. And my son was already discussing it like inventory. That was the moment something shifted permanently inside me. Until then, part of me still hoped this was fear, stress, manipulation from Vanessa. But suddenly, the truth became impossible to deny. Jack believed my life was already over. He thought he was managing an ending. What he didn't understand was that I was still very much alive. And if my son could quietly plan a future without me in it, then maybe I could start planning one without him too. People think revenge always arrives loudly, like screaming, like shattered glass, like dramatic arguments in crowded rooms. But the most dangerous kind of revenge is quiet, careful, patient. And by the 4th week inside Rosewood Senior Living Center, silence had become my specialty. I stopped crying in front of people, stopped asking nurses whether my son had called, stopped sitting near the front entrance during visiting hours like some abandoned dog waiting for its owner to return. Instead, I watched. I listened, and I started planning. The strange thing about betrayal is that eventually the pain hardens into clarity. Every excuse I once made for Jack slowly disappeared. Once I allowed myself to see the truth clearly, all the warning signs from the past few years suddenly connected together like pieces of broken glass. Vanessa encouraging assisted living brochures. Jack asking detailed questions about my finances. The pressure to simplify my life. The sudden concern over property management. It had never been about my well-being. It was about control. And once I understood that something inside me changed permanently. One Tuesday morning, I asked the receptionist to arrange transportation into downtown Savannah. For what purpose, she asked politely. "I need to meet with my attorney." Even saying the words made my pulse quicken. For the first time since arriving at Rosewood, I felt something close to power again. My attorney, Harold Bennett, had known my family for over 20 years. He handled Robert's will after his death and helped me organize my financial affairs afterward. Harold was in his 70s now, with silver hair and tired eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The moment I walked into his office, he frowned. "Sienna," he said softly. What on earth happened that nearly broke me? Because he sounded genuinely concerned. Not burdened, not inconvenienced, concerned. I sat across from him, gripping my purse tightly, while sunlight filtered through the blinds. "My son placed me in a nursing home," I said quietly. Harold's expression darkened immediately. "Against your wishes, he called it temporary." "And is it?" I laughed bitterly. "I don't think so." For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Then he leaned back slowly. "What do you need from me?" That question sat heavily between us. What did I need? Justice, control, protection? Maybe all three. "I want to revise my will." Harold nodded, carefully reaching for a legal pad. "What changes would you like to make?" I stared out the window for several seconds before answering. "My son inherited almost everything after Robert died." "Yes. I don't want that anymore." Harold looked surprised, but not shocked. "Inheritance changes happen often after family conflict," he said gently. "You have every legal right to update your estate." Legal right. Those words felt comforting, because for weeks everyone at Rosewood had treated me like I'd lost ownership over my own life. But I hadn't. Not yet. I want him removed from primary inheritance. Harold's pen stopped moving. "That's a serious decision, Sienna." "I know." "Are you certain?" That question lingered painfully in the room. Because despite everything, part of me still loved Jack with terrifying intensity. Mothers don't stop loving their children simply because they've been hurt by them. That's what makes betrayal from family so devastating. Love survives long after trust dies. I gave that boy everything, I whispered, and he left me here like I was already dead. Harold's face softened. Then he asked quietly, "Who would you like to leave your estate to instead?" And for the first time since entering his office, I hesitated. Because the truth was, I didn't know yet. All I knew was that I couldn't reward what Jack had done. I couldn't spend the rest of my life knowing the people who abandoned me were waiting comfortably for my death. That realization made me physically ill. "I need time," I finally said. Harold nodded. "We can make temporary adjustments now and finalize details later." So that's what we did. We reduced Jack's inheritance rights significantly without eliminating them completely. Harold explained every document carefully while I signed page after page with trembling hands. My signature looked older somehow, sharper, more tired. When we finished, Harold closed the folder gently. "Sienna," he said carefully, "may I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "Is this about punishment or protection?" The question unsettled me because I didn't know the answer. Maybe both. On the ride back to Rosewood, rain streaked across the car windows while Savannah blurred past outside. I watched families walking into restaurants together, couples holding hands beneath umbrellas, young mothers buckling children into car seats. Normal life. I suddenly realized how invisible elderly people become once society decides we've outlived our usefulness. At Rosewood, I started noticing details I'd ignored before. How residents spoke differently when family visited. How nurses smiled more brightly around wealthy relatives. How loneliness hung over the building like permanent fog. One evening during dinner, a frail man named Walter collapsed quietly into tears after receiving a birthday card in the mail. No visitors, just a card. The staff applauded awkwardly while he cried over meatloaf. That image haunted me all night, because I understood exactly what he felt. When affection becomes rare, even tiny scraps of kindness start feeling enormous. A few days later, Jack finally visited. The moment I saw him walking through the lobby in his expensive charcoal coat, my stomach twisted painfully. For one terrible second, I almost ran to hug him. That's how deep motherhood goes. But then I remembered the blocked phone calls, the bank notifications, the empty promises, and I stayed seated. "Hey, Mom," he said casually, like we were discussing weather instead of abandonment. "You came." His expression flickered briefly with discomfort. "I've been busy." Of course he had. Jack sat across from me near the lounge fireplace, checking his phone twice within the first 5 minutes. I noticed everything now. The impatience, the emotional distance, the rehearsed concern. "How are they treating you here?" he asked. "They, the staff." I looked directly into his eyes. "You mean the people you left me with?" His jaw tightened instantly. "Mom, we've been through this." "No," I said calmly. "You talked?" "I listened." He exhaled sharply. "You weren't safe alone anymore. According to who? That's not fair." I almost laughed. Fair? What an interesting word coming from him. Then his tone shifted slightly. "Vanessa and I have also been discussing the house." There it was. Not concerned for me? The house. Always the house. What about it? It's expensive to maintain. Maybe selling it would help cover future care costs. Future care costs? As if my entire existence had become a budget category. I stared at my son quietly, and suddenly I saw him clearly for the first time in years. Not the little boy who once held my hand crossing the street. Not the teenager who hugged me after football games. Just a man already organizing my life after mentally deciding I no longer belonged in it. That was the exact moment my uncertainty disappeared. After Jack left that evening, I returned to my room and opened the small notebook I'd started keeping hidden inside my dresser drawer. On the first blank page, I wrote 5 words carefully: "He will not inherit everything." Then beneath that, for the very first time, I wrote something even more dangerous. "Find someone who deserves it." And somehow, the moment I finished writing those words, I slept peacefully for the first time since my son abandoned me. I met Liam Carter on a Thursday afternoon beside a broken vending machine. If someone had told me a month earlier that a complete stranger would eventually become more compassionate toward me than my own son, I would have called them crazy. But life has a cruel way of introducing truth quietly. That day had already been difficult. Rain hammered against the windows of Rosewood, turning the courtyard gray and miserable. Most residents stayed inside, watching daytime television or dozing in recliners near the lobby fireplace. I was trying to buy a small bag of pretzels when the vending machine swallowed my last $5 bill. I pressed the buttons again. Nothing. I hit the glass weakly with the side of my hand. Still nothing. Those machines only work when they feel spiritually motivated. The voice startled me. I turned and saw a tall black man standing near the hallway entrance, holding a toolbox in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. He looked around, 40 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing worn jeans and a navy work jacket stained with paint. But it was his expression that caught me off guard. Kindness, not forced politeness, not pity, just genuine warmth. I sighed heavily. It stole my money. "Yeah," he said. "That machine's basically a criminal." To my surprise, I laughed. Really laughed. It had been weeks since that happened naturally. The man walked over and crouched beside the machine. "Let me try something." A few seconds later, he hit the side panel with the heel of his hand in exactly the right spot. The machine buzzed violently before dropping both the pretzels and my crumpled $5 bill. "There we go." I stared at him. "How did you do that?" "Single father with 2 younger brothers," he said casually. "You learn survival skills." There was something calm about him. Comfortable. Like someone who had lived through difficult things without allowing bitterness to poison him. "Thank you," I said. You're welcome, Ms. Hamilton. Sienna Hamilton. I'm Liam. He extended his hand politely. His palms were rough with calluses, the hands of someone who actually worked for a living. Before I could say anything else, one of the nurses called his name from across the hall. Liam, maintenance says the boiler room still has a leak. He nodded. Coming. Then he glanced back at me. Try not to declare war on any more vending machines today, all right? And just like that, he disappeared down the hallway. But strangely enough, I kept thinking about him afterward. Over the next few days, I started noticing Liam everywhere around Rosewood. Fixing lights, carrying supply boxes, helping residents adjust wheelchairs. Most workers at Rosewood moved quickly exhausted and distracted. But Liam treated elderly people differently. He stopped to talk. He remembered names. He listened when people rambled. That mattered more than most people realize. Old age can become terrifyingly lonely because eventually everyone starts talking around you instead of to you. But Liam spoke to residents like they still mattered. One morning, I watched him kneel beside Gloria's chair to repair the loose wheel on her walker, while she complained dramatically about the cafeteria eggs. He listened to every word like it was important. Another afternoon, I saw him carry Mr. Delaney's radio upstairs because the old man's arthritis was flaring too badly to lift it himself. No cameras, no applause, no performance, just kindness. Real kindness always reveals itself in small moments. About a week after we first met, I found Liam sitting alone outside near the employee smoking area behind the building. He wasn't smoking. He was just staring at the sunset with visible exhaustion carved into his face. I almost walked past him. Then he looked up and smiled. "Hey, Miss Hamilton?" "Sienna," I corrected gently. He nodded. "Sienna?" I sat carefully on the nearby bench. "You look tired," I said. He laughed softly. That obvious a little. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The evening air smelled like wet grass after rain. Finally, he rubbed his face tiredly. "Double shifts this week. At Rosewood and another job. 2 jobs. 3 technically." I blinked. "When do you sleep?" "Excellent question." He smiled while saying it, but I could see exhaustion beneath the humor. Something about that expression hurt my heart unexpectedly, because I recognized it. I had worn that same tired smile myself years ago while raising Jack. "You have children?" I asked quietly. His expression changed instantly. Not dramatically, just enough. "A daughter," he answered. Something in his voice told me not to push further, but after a moment he continued anyway. "She's 8. That's a beautiful age." "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." There was pain behind those words, deep pain. I noticed the wedding ring mark on his finger, even though he wasn't wearing one anymore. Divorced, maybe, widowed, separated. Whatever the story was, life had clearly bruised him badly. But unlike Jack, Liam didn't seem hardened by suffering. He seemed softened by it. That difference mattered. Over the following weeks, our conversations became routine. Sometimes only 5 minutes, sometimes longer. He'd sit with me after shifts while drinking terrible vending machine coffee, and we'd talk about ordinary things. Savannah weather, music from the 70s, his daughter's obsession with dinosaurs. My late husband Robert's terrible barbecue experiments. For the first time since arriving at Rosewood, I stopped feeling invisible. Liam actually listened when I spoke. Not because he wanted something, not because he felt obligated. He simply cared. One afternoon, I mentioned offhandedly that I missed gardening. The next morning, he appeared outside the courtyard holding a small clay flower pot. "I found this at a flea market," he said awkwardly. "Thought maybe you could use it." Inside the pot were tiny lavender sprouts. I stared at him in shock. "You remembered?" Of course I remembered. Such simple words. but they nearly made me cry. Because my own son no longer remembered anything about me unless it involved paperwork or medical forms. Meanwhile, a stranger remembered I liked lavender. That realization shook me deeply. The more time I spent around Liam, the more ashamed I became of how quickly society judges people based on status. Jack wore tailored suits and drove luxury cars. Liam repaired leaking pipes and worked himself into exhaustion. But only one of them still understood human dignity. One evening, I finally asked the question that had quietly lingered in my mind. "Why do you work so hard?" Liam stared down at his coffee cup. Then he smiled sadly. "Because losing everything once is enough." I waited. Eventually he spoke again. "My ex-wife left 2 years ago, took most of our savings. I've been trying to rebuild ever since." There it was, the pain I'd sensed beneath the surface. "She left your daughter too." His jaw tightened. "No," he said quickly. "I still have custody half the week." The relief in his voice was immediate, and suddenly I understood something important. This man measured wealth differently, not in money, in love, in presence, in loyalty. After that conversation, I returned to my room unable to stop thinking. About Jack, about Liam, about the terrifying difference between them. One shared my blood. The other shared my humanity. That night, I opened the notebook hidden in my dresser drawer. Under the sentence, "Find someone who deserves it," I slowly added another line. Maybe I already have. And for the first time since being abandoned at Rosewood, the idea no longer felt like revenge. It felt like justice. Once the idea settled into my heart, it became impossible to ignore. I was going to change everything. Not impulsively, not emotionally, carefully, legally, quietly. And somehow, that made it feel even more powerful. For the next several days, I said nothing to anyone at Rosewood. Outwardly, I behaved exactly the same. I attended the occasional bingo night. I smiled politely during physical therapy sessions. I let nurses check my blood pressure while daytime television droned in the background. But internally, my entire world had shifted. Every interaction with Jack now carried a strange distance inside me. Not rage anymore. Something colder. Acceptance. Once you truly accept someone is capable of hurting you, they stop having the same emotional control over your life. And that terrified me a little, because I had spent 38 years defining myself as Jack Hamilton's mother. Who was I if I stopped centering my entire identity around him? One Friday morning, Harold Bennett visited Rosewood personally instead of asking me to come downtown again. He arrived carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the same tired gray suit he'd probably owned since the late 90s. The nurses treated him with sudden exaggerated politeness the moment they realized he was an attorney. Funny how quickly people change when legal paperwork enters the room. We sat together in a small private lounge near the activity center. "You've been thinking," Harold said immediately. "I have," and I folded my hands tightly together. "I know who I want the inheritance to go to." Harold studied me carefully over the top of his glasses. "Someone charitable? A foundation? No. A relative? No." He leaned back slightly. "Sienna," who I hesitated only briefly. "A man named Liam Carter." Silence. Not judgmental silence. Surprised silence. Harold blinked twice slowly. "The maintenance employee here." "Yes. And how long have you known him?" "About 6 weeks." His eyebrows lifted carefully. "That's not a very long time." "No," I admitted. "But sometimes 6 weeks tells you more about someone than 30 years. That answer seemed to affect him. Harold opened his legal pad slowly. "Tell me about him." So I did. I told him about the vending machine, the flower pot with lavender, the way Liam treated residents with dignity when nobody was watching, the exhaustion in his eyes, the tenderness in his voice whenever he mentioned his daughter. And finally, I told Harold the most important truth of all. He sees me as a person, I whispered. Not a burden, not an obligation. A person. Harold listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, he removed his glasses thoughtfully. You understand this will devastate your son. The words landed heavily in my chest. Because despite everything I knew they were true, Jack expected that inheritance. The Savannah house alone had become extremely valuable over the years. Combined with Robert's investments and our savings, the estate was worth far more than Jack probably realized. Enough to change someone's future completely. Maybe that's why Jack had started treating me like an asset instead of a mother. The thought still made me sick. I'm not doing this to destroy him, I said quietly. Then why are you doing it? I stared down at my hands for several seconds. Because I need my life to mean something more than being abandoned. Harold's expression softened instantly. Then he nodded slowly. All right. The paperwork process took nearly 2 hours. Every signature felt strangely surreal, as though I was watching another woman rewrite her life from outside her body. Harold explained each document carefully. The house, the accounts, the investment portfolio, specific conditions, specific protections. By the end, Liam Carter stood to inherit nearly everything. Jack would receive only a modest trust fund Robert had originally insisted remain untouched for sentimental reasons. That was it. The balance of power had shifted completely, and Jack had absolutely no idea. Before leaving, Harold closed the folder carefully. One more thing, he said. What you should be prepared for challenges later. You think Jack will contest the will? I think grief mixed with entitlement can make people unpredictable. Entitlement, such an ugly word, and yet painfully accurate. After Harold left, I sat alone in the quiet lounge trying to process what I'd just done. My hands trembled slightly, not from regret, from fear. Because, for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself over my son. Mothers aren't taught how to survive that emotionally. We're taught sacrifice, endless forgiveness, unconditional understanding. But nobody teaches women what to do when unconditional love becomes self-destruction. That afternoon, Liam found me sitting alone near the courtyard fountain. You all right? He asked gently. I looked up too quickly. Why, you seem overwhelmed. I almost laughed at how easily he noticed. Jack hadn't noticed my emotional state in years. I'm fine, I said automatically. Liam sat beside me anyway. You know, he said softly, people who say, I'm fine, like that usually aren't. That nearly unraveled me. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Then quietly, before I could stop myself, I asked, do you ever feel guilty for finally putting yourself first? His expression changed immediately, all the time. The honesty of that answer stunned me. He leaned back against the bench slowly. When my marriage ended, I kept blaming myself for everything. I worked longer hours trying to fix things financially because I thought sacrifice would save the relationship. And did it? No. He smiled sadly. Some people just get comfortable receiving love without returning it. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Because suddenly, I realized something horrifying. Jack had spent years receiving my love as though it were guaranteed. Permanent, automatic, like oxygen. And maybe that was partly my fault. Maybe I taught him my forgiveness had no limits. Liam glanced toward me carefully. You okay? I nodded too fast. Just thinking. He didn't push further. That was another thing about Liam. He respected emotional boundaries instead of controlling them. a quality I suddenly realized Jack lacked completely. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. As I walked past the nurse's station, I overheard two employees whispering quietly. "That's the lawyer lady," one murmured. "The one changing her estate." My footsteps froze instantly. The second nurse lowered her voice. "I heard she's cutting her son out." My stomach tightened. So someone knew, or at least suspected. I kept walking calmly, pretending not to hear anything, but panic crawled slowly up my spine afterward. News spreads fast in places like Rosewood. Too fast. That night, I barely slept. Not because I regretted the decision. Because I suddenly realized how explosive the truth would become once Jack discovered it. I imagined his face. The anger. The disbelief. Maybe even hatred. For the first time, I wondered whether he had ever truly loved me, or simply loved the life I gave him. That question haunted me until morning. The next day, Jack called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But old habits die hard. "Hey, Mom," he said casually. "Hello, Jack. I was thinking Vanessa and I might come visit next weekend." The mention of her immediately exhausted me. "That's not necessary." There was a pause. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm doing all right. You sound strange. Funny." After abandoning me for weeks, suddenly he noticed my tone. "I'm just tired." Then his voice shifted slightly. "By the way, have you spoken to Harold recently?" Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. "No," I lied smoothly. Another silence. Longer this time. Then finally, "Okay, just checking." But something in his voice had changed. Suspicion. Sharp and alert. And as the call ended, one terrifying realization settled heavily into my chest. Jack was starting to notice that he was losing control. The first sign that Jack was panicking came 3 days later. Before then, his visits had been rare and rushed. His phone always stayed in his hand. His attention always drifted somewhere else. Every conversation felt like a business meeting he was trying to end quickly. But suddenly, everything changed. He started calling twice a day, then 3 times. When I didn't answer immediately, he left tense voicemails, pretending to sound casual. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Call me when you get this." "You okay?" It would have been comforting once. Now it only felt suspicious. Because deep down, I knew what triggered it. Not guilt, fear. Somehow he had sensed control slipping away. That Friday afternoon, Rosewood's receptionist informed me that Jack had arrived unexpectedly. I was sitting in the courtyard with Gloria, helping her untangle yarn for a knitting project, when I saw him marching across the lawn in an expensive navy coat. His movements were sharp, restless. Anxiety radiated from him. For the first time in months, my son looked afraid. Sienna Gloria whispered beside me, "Your boy looks like he's about to argue with God." I almost smiled. Jack reached us quickly. "Mom, can we talk privately?" His voice sounded strained. I glanced at Gloria. She raised an eyebrow dramatically before wheeling herself away without a word. Jack sat down across from me immediately. "What's going on?" he asked. "With what, with you?" I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "I'm sitting outside. Don't do that. Do what act confused." There it was. Not concern, frustration. Like I was disrupting some carefully managed situation. I looked directly at him. "You seem nervous?" His jaw tightened instantly. "I stopped by your house yesterday." My pulse slowed strangely instead of quickening, and the realtor lockbox was gone. I blinked slowly. I didn't know there was one. That wasn't entirely a lie. I never personally saw it. but hearing confirmation still hurt. Jack rubbed his forehead impatiently. The property manager said someone revoked access authorization. Interesting. Sienna. That tone. Sharp. Warning. For one brief second, I saw the little boy he used to be vanish completely. Sitting in front of me wasn't my child anymore. Just a man angry that a financial arrangement might no longer benefit him. I spoke with Harold, Jack said, carefully. So there it was. He knew, or at least suspected enough to investigate. And I repeated calmly. He wouldn't tell me anything. Attorney-client privilege. Mom. What his voice lowered. Why are you changing things? The question hung heavily between us. I studied his face carefully. And for the first time, I noticed something deeply unsettling. Jack didn't look heartbroken. He looked threatened. There's a difference. If he had walked into Rosewood desperate to repair our relationship, maybe things would have unfolded differently. But instead, his first concern was legal paperwork. The inheritance, the house, the accounts, not me. Never me. You abandoned me here, I said quietly. His expression hardened immediately. That's not fair. Isn't it you needed care? I needed my son. For a moment, silence swallowed us completely. Wind moved softly through the courtyard trees overhead. Somewhere nearby, another resident laughed faintly at something on television. Ordinary sounds. Extraordinary heartbreak. Jack leaned forward suddenly. Vanessa and I were trying to help you. By changing my address without permission. His face froze. Small reaction. But enough to confirm everything. I had to make things easier administratively. God. Everything became paperwork to him eventually. You blocked my number? No. You blocked it? I was busy. I stared at him quietly. Then finally, after weeks of swallowing my pain, I asked the question that had poisoned my thoughts every night since arriving at Rosewood. Did you even miss me? Jack opened his mouth immediately, then stopped. That hesitation shattered something final inside me. Because if you truly love someone, that answer doesn't require thinking. I've had a lot going on, he muttered. Not yes, not of course, not every day, just excuses. Again, always excuses. I leaned back slowly. When your father died, I said quietly, I thought losing him would be the loneliest experience of my life. Jack looked away immediately. But this, I whispered. Being discarded by my own child while I'm still alive. His eyes closed briefly. You're exaggerating. Exaggerating. I almost laughed from disbelief. He left me in a nursing facility against my wishes, reorganized my finances, discussed selling my home, and blocked my calls. And somehow, I was still the unreasonable one. That realization finally removed the last traces of guilt I'd been carrying. Jack stood abruptly. Look, he snapped, if this is about the inheritance. There it is. He froze. The real concern. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He rubbed his face angrily. You're being manipulated. By who? That lawyer. People here. Whoever's filling your head with nonsense. The irony nearly made me dizzy. Because for months, he and Vanessa had been the ones quietly manipulating me, reducing my independence, controlling my environment, making decisions without consent. But now that I was thinking independently again, suddenly, I was confused. That's how control works. The moment you resist it, they question your stability. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said calmly. Jack stared at me for several seconds. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. This is because of someone here, isn't it? My heart skipped once. Not visibly, but enough. And Jack noticed. A terrible silence followed. Then slowly, dangerously slowly, he asked, Who is he? Cold spread through my chest instantly. I hadn't realized until that moment how closely Jack had been observing things. There's no he, I answered carefully, but he didn't believe me. I could see it immediately. What's his name? Nobody. Mom? His tone sharpened again. Who are you talking to? I stood carefully from the bench. The conversation was over. You don't get to interrogate me anymore. He looked stunned. Honestly stunned. As though the idea of me setting boundaries had never occurred to him before. I'm your son. And I'm still your mother, I said quietly, though you seem to forget that whenever it becomes inconvenient. For one fleeting second, real emotion crossed his face. Pain, not financial panic, actual pain, and strangely enough, that hurt me too. Because buried underneath all this ugliness, part of Jack still existed somewhere. I could see fragments of him fighting beneath the entitlement and selfishness. But fragments weren't enough anymore. As I turned to leave, his voice stopped me. Did Vanessa tell you we're expecting? I froze completely. Slowly, I turned back around. What Jack swallowed hard. She's pregnant. The world tilted slightly beneath me. A baby. My grandchild? For several seconds, I couldn't breathe properly. You were going to tell me eventually, he added quietly. Eventually. Like I was some distant relative instead of his mother. Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Not joyful tears, grieving tears. Because even this beautiful news had become tangled in secrecy and distance. How far along? Almost 4 months. 4 months. They had hidden it from me for 4 months. I suddenly understood why his panic had intensified recently. It wasn't just the inheritance anymore. It was the future he already imagined for his growing family. The future he assumed I would fund. And maybe for the first time since this nightmare began, Jack realized that future was slipping away. As I walked back toward Rosewood's entrance, I could feel him staring after me, but he didn't follow. And somehow, that hurt most of all, because even now, my son still didn't know how to fight for me. For 2 days after Jack told me Vanessa was pregnant, I could barely think straight. A grandchild. The word alone carried enough emotional weight to crack open every wall I had built around my heart. I found myself imagining tiny fingers wrapped around mine, Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, teaching a little girl how to bake Robert's peach cobbler recipe, or maybe a little boy with Jack's old crooked smile. The grief hit me unexpectedly hard, because suddenly this wasn't only about losing my son anymore. It was about losing an entire future I thought I would be part of. That terrified me. And somehow Liam noticed immediately. We were sitting outside near the courtyard garden one evening while the sky turned deep orange behind the trees. Liam had just finished replacing broken ceiling panels upstairs and looked exhausted, but he still sat beside me with 2 paper cups of coffee balanced carefully in his hands. You've been quiet today, he said gently. I'm old, I answered automatically. We get quiet. He smiled faintly. No, this is different quiet. I stared down into my coffee cup for several seconds before speaking. My son is having a baby. Liam's face lit up instantly. That's amazing. I nodded slowly. Yes. But my voice cracked on the word, and immediately his expression softened. Oh, he said quietly. He understood. That's what made Liam different from most people. He listened beneath words, instead of only hearing them. You think they'll keep you away from the child? He said carefully. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard. I don't know anymore. The evening breeze moved softly through the lavender plants nearby. Finally, I whispered the fear I'd been too ashamed to say out loud. What if my son only came back because he realized I changed the will? Liam didn't answer immediately. That silence itself felt respectful. Too many people rush to comfort others with lies because honesty feels uncomfortable. But Liam never did that. I think he said slowly, "People can love you and still use you at the same time." The sentence hit me with painful precision, because that was exactly what this felt like. Not absence of love, distorted love, conditional love, convenient love. I keep wondering if I failed him somehow, I admitted quietly. You didn't. You don't know that. He looked directly at me then. No, he said gently. I know people make their own choices eventually. Something inside me loosened slightly hearing those words. Because mothers carry impossible guilt. We blame ourselves for every flaw our children develop, even long after they become adults responsible for their own decisions. Liam leaned back against the bench. My father left when I was 10, he said suddenly. I turned toward him in surprise. You never mentioned that. Wasn't much worth mentioning. His tone was casual, but pain still lived underneath it. He'd disappear for months, then come back making promises. Birthdays, basketball games, school events. He missed most of them. I'm sorry. He shrugged faintly. You get used to disappointment eventually. No child should ever get used to disappointment from a parent. The thought broke my heart instantly. What about your mother? I asked softly. A faint smile touched his face. She worked herself into the ground, raising us. Something warm passed through me hearing that. The way he said us, protectively, respectfully. She sounds strong. She was exhausted, he corrected gently. There's a difference. That sentence stayed with me long after he said it, because exhaustion and strength often look identical from the outside. Suddenly, I realized Liam saw women like his mother the same way he saw me. Not as burdens, as survivors. Over the following weeks, our friendship deepened naturally. Not romantically, not dramatically, just two lonely people slowly becoming important to each other. Sometimes he brought me fresh fruit from a farmer's market near his apartment because he complained Rosewood vegetables looked emotionally defeated. Sometimes I helped him fill out paperwork for his daughter's school fundraiser because he hated dealing with forms after long shifts. Ordinary things. Human things. One Saturday afternoon, Liam surprised me by bringing his daughter to Rosewood after work. This is Ava, he said carefully. The little girl hiding behind his leg had warm brown skin, bright curious eyes, and tightly braided hair decorated with yellow beads that clicked softly whenever she moved. She couldn't have been older than 8. Hi, she whispered shyly. Hello, sweetheart. Liam rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Our babysitter canceled unexpectedly. That's perfectly all right. Ava spent the next hour coloring beside me while Liam repaired a broken television mount in the recreation room nearby. At one point, she looked up from her crayons seriously. My daddy says you make the best stories. I blinked. He says that, she nodded confidently. He said, you're nice because you still listen when people talk. The innocence of that statement nearly shattered me. Still listen when people talk. Such a small thing, yet apparently rare enough to matter deeply. A little later, Ava proudly showed me a drawing she'd made. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a giant yellow sun. That's me and Daddy, she explained, pointing. And who's this? She smiled shyly. You. My throat tightened instantly. Children reveal emotional truths, adults spend years hiding from themselves. For the first time since arriving at Rosewood, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Needed, not for money, not for obligation. Simply wanted. After Ava fell asleep curled against Liam's shoulder later that evening, I watched him carry her carefully toward the parking lot. The tenderness in that moment hit me unexpectedly hard, because suddenly I understood something devastating. Liam gave his daughter the emotional presence Jack no longer gave me, and somehow a stranger's kindness was healing wounds my own child created. A few days later, Gloria cornered me in the hallway with startling directness. "You're glowing." I nearly laughed. "At my age, that's probably medication." "No," she said firmly. "It's that maintenance man." I rolled my eyes immediately. "It's not like that." "Mm-hmm." "Gloria." She leaned closer dramatically. "That man looks at you like you still exist." The words stunned me silent, because she was right. That's exactly what had changed. Liam saw me fully, not as an aging inconvenience, not as a legal responsibility, not as future inheritance paperwork, as Sienna, a woman, a human being. That realization became impossible to ignore after that. One rainy evening, Liam and I sat in the lobby while thunder rolled outside. Rosewood lost power briefly before emergency lights flickered on softly throughout the building. The storm made several residents nervous. Liam moved calmly from room to room, helping nurses reassure everyone until things stabilized again. Hours later, exhausted, he finally sat beside me near the darkened fireplace. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I smiled faintly. "You always ask me that. Someone should." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then unexpectedly he asked, "Why did your son stop seeing you?" The question hurt because I didn't know. "Not completely. I think—" I whispered slowly. Success made him afraid of becoming weak. Liam frowned slightly. "And you represent weakness." "No," I said sadly. "Aging does." He stared into the darkness quietly for a moment. Then he said something I would never forget. "People who fear aging usually fear accountability too." I looked at him sharply. He shrugged faintly. "Old people remember who you used to be." That sentence settled deep inside my chest, because maybe that was why Jack struggled around me now. I remembered him before the money, before ambition swallowed tenderness whole, and maybe some part of him hated being seen that clearly. As the storm continued outside, I realized something else too. Somewhere along the way, Liam Carter had quietly become the safest person in my life, and that truth frightened me almost as much as it comforted me. Jack found out 3 weeks before Christmas. Not officially, not through Harold, through Vanessa, and somehow that made everything uglier. It happened on a Monday afternoon while I was helping Gloria decorate paper snowflakes in the activity room. Rosewood had started hanging cheap plastic garlands across the hallways, and Bing Crosby songs drifted endlessly through the speakers. The holidays make abandonment feel sharper. Every decoration becomes a reminder of who isn't coming home. I was cutting silver ribbon when the receptionist appeared nervously in the doorway. "Sienna." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten instantly. "Yes, your son is here." Before I could respond, Jack stormed into the room. Not walked, stormed. Every resident nearby went silent immediately. His face was pale with anger. Not grief, not heartbreak. Anger. "Sienna," he snapped. "Outside. Now." The room froze. Gloria muttered under her breath, "Well, this should ruin everybody's afternoon." I stood slowly. Jack now. The fury in his voice startled even me. For one terrible second, I saw Robert in him, not the kindness, but the temper Robert fought his entire life to control. I followed Jack into the empty hallway near the physical therapy wing. The moment the doors closed behind us, he turned toward me sharply. "You changed the will. Not a question. An accusation." I said nothing. His breathing was uneven. How long were you planning this? Still, I stayed silent. That only enraged him further. Vanessa found paperwork. My pulse quickened. What paperwork? Documents from Harold's office? Damn it. Harold must have mailed copies before updating delivery preferences completely. Jack laughed bitterly and dragged a hand through his hair. A stranger, he said in disbelief. You're giving everything to some stranger? So now he knew about Liam too. I should have felt panic. Instead, strangely, I felt calm. Because the secret was finally exposed. No more hiding. No more pretending. You left me here, I said quietly. That's not an excuse for this. No, I replied softly. It's the reason. Jack stared at me like he no longer recognized me. Honestly, maybe he didn't. The version of Sienna Hamilton who accepted emotional neglect silently was disappearing, and my son had no idea how to handle that. You're being manipulated, he hissed. Stop saying that. You think this guy actually cares about you? The contempt in his voice made my chest tighten instantly, because beneath the anger, I heard something else. Class judgment. Liam worked maintenance. Liam struggled financially. And people like Jack always assume poor people must have selfish motives. Meanwhile, wealthy cruelty gets excused as stress. You don't know him, I said carefully. And you do. Jack snapped. You've known him, 2 months, long enough to know he'd never abandon his mother in a nursing facility. But I didn't say that aloud. Jack paced the hallway furiously. Do you have any idea what this looks like? That sentence told me everything. Not feels like. Looks like. Image, reputation, perception. Those things mattered desperately to him now. You embarrassed us, he continued. Us, meaning him and Vanessa. Not once had he asked how devastated I'd been. Only how my decisions affected them. I looked at him quietly. Did you ever love me? I asked softly, outside of obligation. Jack froze completely. The question clearly caught him off guard. What kind of thing is that to ask a truthful one? Of course I love you, but did you value me? Silence? Again. Always silence where love should have been immediate. Finally, Jack exhaled sharply. You're twisting everything. No, I whispered. I'm finally seeing it clearly. His eyes hardened instantly. You're punishing me. That word lingered painfully between us. Punishing. Maybe part of me was, but another part simply refused to reward betrayal anymore. There's a difference between punishment and consequences, I said quietly. Jack laughed bitterly. So what, you're replacing me now? The cruelty of the sentence stunned me. Because somehow even now he saw inheritance as competition instead of pain. No one can replace my son. Then why are you doing this? I stared at him for several seconds before answering. Because a stranger treated me with more dignity in 2 months than my own child has in years. That hit him. Really hit him. I saw it immediately. His face changed. Not angry this time. Wounded. For one brief moment, guilt finally broke through his defensiveness. And suddenly, beneath all the corporate polish and entitlement, I glimpsed the little boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on my foot as a child. You think I'm a bad person? He whispered. The pain in his voice almost broke me. Because despite everything, I didn't think he was evil, just lost, selfish, morally asleep. I think I said carefully you stopped seeing me as human. Jack looked away immediately. That silence confirmed everything. A few moments later, he spoke again, quieter now. Vanessa's terrified. Of what? That we can't afford the baby if things fall apart. There it was. Finally. The truth beneath all the anger, fear, not just greed. Fear, the house, the inheritance, the financial safety net. Their future depended on resources they already emotionally claimed as theirs. And suddenly, I understood something heartbreaking. Jack had built his adult life assuming my sacrifices would continue forever, even after abandonment, even after humiliation. Mothers aren't retirement plans, I whispered. His eyes filled instantly with emotion. Don't do that. Do what make me sound heartless. The irony nearly crushed me, because he still cared more about appearing cruel than acknowledging cruelty itself. Then, something unexpected happened. Jack sat down heavily against the hallway wall and covered his face with both hands. And for the first time in months, my son looked exhausted instead of angry. I don't know how things got this bad, he whispered. Neither did I. That was the tragedy. Nobody wakes up one morning planning to emotionally abandon their parent. It happens slowly. Tiny, selfish decisions, tiny emotional distances, tiny rationalizations, until one day love becomes maintenance instead of connection. I sat beside him quietly. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then finally he asked, "Does this guy know?" Jack looked genuinely shocked. You haven't told him no. Why not? Because somehow that mattered to me deeply. Liam had been kind without expecting reward. Pure kindness is rare, and I refused to contaminate it with money. He never asked me for anything, I answered softly. Jack stared at the floor silently, and I think in that moment, part of him understood exactly what I meant, because somewhere deep down, he realized how transactional our relationship had become. Finally, he spoke again. I was trying to protect my family. And what was I? The question shattered the hallway into silence. Jack's eyes closed slowly, because he had no answer. None. Not one. A nurse passed nearby awkwardly, pretending not to notice us. Far away, Christmas music continued drifting through the building speakers. Have yourself a merry little Christmas. Cruel song choice for a nursing home. Jack stood slowly after a while. What happens now? Such a simple question, and yet neither of us truly knew, because this was no longer only about money. It was about whether broken love could survive truth. I don't know, I admitted. Jack nodded once. Then before leaving, he asked quietly, "Did you ever stop loving me?" That question nearly destroyed me, because no matter what he'd done, the answer was still no. I wish it were that easy, I whispered. Jack looked like he might cry, but instead, he turned and walked away. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized my son was finally starting to understand the damage he'd caused. The problem was, understanding pain and undoing it are two very different things. After Jack found out about the will, everything became tense. Not explosive, not dramatic. Worse, careful, measured. Like two people standing in a flooded house, pretending not to notice the water rising around them. For the next week, Jack visited Rosewood almost every day. At first, part of me wanted to believe it was because our confrontation finally reached him emotionally. Maybe he realized how deeply he'd hurt me. Maybe fear had shocked him awake. But the longer I watched him, the more complicated the truth became. Because guilt and self-interest were tangled together inside him so tightly, even he probably couldn't separate them anymore. One afternoon, he brought flowers, white lilies, my favorite, and somehow that made me sadder than if he'd brought nothing at all. Because he only remembered my favorite flowers after learning he might lose the inheritance. I stared at the bouquet while he awkwardly arranged them in the plastic vase beside my bed. You didn't have to do this, I said quietly. I wanted to. Did he? Or did he want to repair leverage? The terrible thing about broken trust is that eventually every kindness starts feeling suspicious. Jack sat near the window afterward while winter rain tapped softly against the glass. Rosewood looked especially lonely during December. Christmas decorations hung everywhere, trying desperately to disguise the sadness woven into the building itself. Some residents had families visiting constantly. Others had no one. The imbalance broke my heart more each day. "How's Vanessa?" I asked eventually. Jack hesitated, tired. "How far along is she now?" 5 months. I nodded slowly. A grandson or granddaughter was growing somewhere beyond these walls, and I still hadn't touched a single ultrasound photo. That grief sat permanently inside my chest now. "She wants to see you," Jack said carefully. I looked up sharply. "Does she feels bad about everything?" That almost made me laugh. Vanessa didn't feel bad. Vanessa felt nervous. There's a difference. Still, I didn't say that aloud. "What exactly does she feel bad about?" I asked softly. Jack rubbed his hands together uneasily. The way things happened, things. Always vague language. Nobody ever said abandoned. Manipulated. Discarded. People soften ugly truths with softer vocabulary so they can live with themselves easier. "She helped convince you to put me here," I said calmly. Jack looked away immediately. It wasn't just her, but she agreed with it. Another silence. God, there had been so many silences between us lately. "You have no idea how much pressure we were under," he whispered suddenly. I stared at him carefully. "What pressure? The baby, bills, work, Vanessa's complications. Complications!" My stomach tightened. "What complications?" Jack sighed heavily. "She had some bleeding early on. The doctor said stress could make things worse." Fear flickered painfully through me. Despite everything, I didn't want harm touching that child. "Is the baby all right so far?" I nodded slowly. For a few moments, neither of us spoke again. Then finally, I asked the question quietly lingering beneath everything else. "So you put me here because your life became stressful?" "That's not what I'm saying. It sounds like it." Jack stood suddenly and walked toward the window. "I was drowning," he snapped. That sentence surprised me. Not because of the anger. Because it sounded honest. Real. For the first time in months, my son didn't sound polished or defensive. He sounded exhausted. "I had work demanding 70 hours a week," he continued. "Vanessa kept getting sick. The mortgage was getting worse. Then you fell on the porch, and suddenly I was terrified something worse would happen." I listened quietly. I didn't know how to handle everything he admitted. And there it was. The closest thing to truth we'd reached yet. Not evil, cowardice, emotional weakness. Jack didn't know how to carry pressure without sacrificing someone else emotionally. Specifically me. "I would have helped you," I whispered. "You already spent your whole life helping me. That's what family does." He turned sharply. "No," he said bitterly. "That's what you do." The sentence stunned me silent. Jack laughed harshly and dragged both hands through his hair. "You gave everything to everyone your entire life, Mom, Dad, me, everybody. And then you expected us to somehow become emotionally perfect because of it." Pain spread slowly through my chest. Because part of that was true. Not the abandonment. Never that. But maybe I had taught Jack something dangerous accidentally. That Sienna Hamilton would survive anything quietly. That her sacrifices were endless, automatic, unbreakable. "I never asked for perfection," I whispered. "No," he said tiredly. "You just made sacrifice look normal." The room fell silent again. I hated how much those words affected me. Because motherhood often becomes invisible labor, precisely because women perform it so consistently. People stop noticing the cost. Eventually, even children mistake sacrifice for natural law. Jack sat down again heavily. I know I handled things badly. Badly. Still too soft, but closer. You treated me like I was already gone. His eyes filled immediately with shame. That wasn't intentional. That doesn't make it hurt less. A long silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Jack looked toward the hallway before lowering his voice. Are you in love with him? The question startled me completely. With Liam, Jack nodded once. I almost answered immediately. No. But the truth was more complicated than that. What I felt for Liam wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was trust, safety, emotional recognition. And after months of loneliness, those things become deeply intimate. I care about him, I answered honestly. Jack's jaw tightened visibly. You barely know him. Sometimes people reveal themselves quickly. And what am I supposed to do with that? He asked bitterly. The pain in his voice caught me off guard. Because underneath the anger, he sounded jealous. Not of money, of emotional closeness. My son suddenly realized another man knew me better than he did now, and that wounded him deeply. He listens to me, I said quietly. Jack looked down instantly. He remembers things. Still silence. He treats people kindly when there's nothing to gain from it. Jack closed his eyes briefly. Every sentence landed exactly where I intended. Not cruelly, truthfully. Finally, after several long moments, he whispered, I didn't realize you were that lonely. That sentence nearly broke me. Because loneliness that obvious should never surprise your own child. Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes. I used to wait by the phone after your father died, I admitted quietly. Jack looked up slowly. Every Sunday. My voice trembled now. You promised you'd call every Sunday after moving to Charlotte. Shame flooded his face instantly. There were weeks I sat in that house all day waiting for your voice, I whispered. Do you know what it feels like to matter less and less to your own child every year? Jack looked physically ill. Good. Not because I wanted him suffering. Because for the first time, he was finally feeling the emotional reality of what he'd done, instead of only defending it logically. I'm sorry, he whispered. And somehow, that hurt most of all. Because he meant it. Not fully, not perfectly, but genuinely. The problem was that apologies don't automatically rebuild trust. Some damage changes relationships permanently. Jack wiped at his eyes, roughly embarrassed by his own emotion. Then he asked the question I think he'd been avoiding for weeks. Is there anything I can do to fix this? I looked at my son quietly for a very long time. The little boy who once slept on my chest during thunderstorms still existed somewhere inside this man. But adulthood had layered ambition, fear, selfishness, and pride over him so heavily that reaching him now felt almost impossible. Finally, I answered honestly. I don't know. And that uncertainty devastated both of us, because deep down, we were finally realizing love alone might not be enough anymore. I didn't tell Liam about the inheritance until 3 days before Christmas. Not because I distrusted him, because I was afraid of changing something pure. Money changes the temperature of relationships. It introduces tension, expectation, imbalance, and selfish people often assume everyone else operates the same way they do. But Liam never asked me for anything. Not once. That mattered more than he probably realized. The day I finally told him Savannah was wrapped in cold rain and heavy gray clouds. Rosewood's Christmas tree blinked softly in the lobby, while old holiday songs played too quietly through ceiling speakers. Liam had just finished helping maintenance fix a burst pipe on the second floor. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing tired muscles in his forearms, and exhaustion shadowed his eyes. Still, when he saw me sitting alone near the fireplace, he smiled immediately. "There's my favorite troublemaker." I laughed softly. "You say that because I almost destroyed the vending machine. That machine deserved it." He sat beside me, holding 2 coffees. For a few minutes, we talked normally. Ava's school holiday concert, the freezing weather, Gloria threatening to attack a nurse with a candy cane because someone changed television channels during her soap opera. Ordinary conversation. Safe conversation. But my chest stayed tight the entire time. Finally, I interrupted him quietly. "I need to tell you something." Liam looked over immediately. The seriousness in my voice erased his smile. "What's wrong?" I stared into the coffee cup, warming my hands. "My son found out I changed my will." Silence. Not shocked silence. Careful silence. "You don't have to explain anything to me," Liam said gently. "I want to." That made him pause. I swallowed hard before continuing. "I changed it because Jack abandoned me here." His expression darkened instantly. I told him everything then. The temporary nursing home stay, the blocked calls, the financial control, the real estate conversations. Vanessa. All of it. Liam listened without interrupting once. But by the time I finished, anger radiated visibly from him. "That's unforgivable." "No," I whispered sadly. "It's human." He shook his head sharply. "No? Being overwhelmed is human? Being selfish is human? Treating your mother like an inconvenience?" His jaw tightened. "That's a choice." The intensity in his voice startled me, because Liam almost never spoke harshly about anyone. "What happened to you?" I asked softly. He blinked. "What? People don't react that strongly unless they understand something personally." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew I was right. Liam leaned back heavily against the couch. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then finally, very quietly, "My mother died alone." The room seemed to still completely around us. What his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. I was 23, working construction in Atlanta. His voice sounded distant now. "She called me 3 times one night while I was working overtime." Pain spread slowly through my chest. "I didn't answer," he whispered. "Oh God, she left voicemails saying she wasn't feeling well." I listened to them the next morning after my shift ended. His voice cracked. She'd had a stroke. I covered my mouth instantly. Liam stared straight ahead now, completely somewhere else emotionally. I got to the hospital too late. The grief in his face nearly shattered me. And suddenly, so many things about him made sense. The tenderness toward elderly residents, the patience, the instinctive kindness, the exhaustion mixed with guilt. "She died before I arrived," he whispered. I reached for his hand without thinking. His fingers trembled immediately beneath mine. "I'm so sorry." He laughed bitterly under his breath. "You know the worst part?" I shook my head slowly. "She spent her whole life protecting me from hardship." His eyes filled, and when she needed me most, I was too busy chasing overtime pay. Tears burned instantly behind my eyes, because suddenly I understood the deep sorrow living inside him all this time. Liam didn't help elderly people because he was naturally saintly. He helped them because guilt had broken his heart open permanently. "I still hear those voicemails sometimes," he admitted quietly, "especially at night." Neither of us spoke for a while after that. Christmas lights blinked softly nearby while rain tapped against the windows. Finally, Liam looked toward me carefully. So when you changed the will, he hesitated. Who did you leave things to? There it was, the moment I'd been avoiding. My pulse quickened painfully. You. He froze completely. Actually froze. Then slowly he pulled his hand away. No, it's already done. No, he repeated firmly. Absolutely not. His reaction shocked me. Not because he refused, because he looked horrified. I'm serious, I whispered. Sienna, no. You deserve, I don't want your money. The force in his voice turned several heads nearby. He lowered it immediately afterward, visibly upset. I didn't spend time with you because of money. I know that. Then why would you do this? Because you treated me like I still mattered. Because you remembered my favorite flowers? Because your daughter drew me into her family picture without being asked? Because my own child forgot how to see me? But instead of saying all that, I whispered the simplest truth. Because kindness should matter. Liam stood abruptly and walked several feet away, visibly emotional. For a moment, I thought he might actually leave. Instead, he pressed both hands against the back of his neck while trying to steady himself. This is wrong, he muttered. No, I answered softly. Being abandoned was wrong. He turned sharply. You don't fix pain like that by giving away your entire life to somebody you barely know. I know you enough. No, you don't. His voice cracked suddenly, and then before I could respond, he said the one thing I never expected. My ex-wife left because of my gambling debt. I stared at him in shock. The confession seemed to physically hurt him. I stopped 2 years ago, he said quickly. Therapy, support groups, all of it. But I lost almost everything before I got clean. The room tilted slightly beneath me. Not because I judged him, because he looked terrified. Terrified I would suddenly see him differently. That's why I work constantly, he admitted quietly. I'm trying to rebuild my daughter's life after destroying it. I absorbed his words slowly. Then something unexpected happened. I felt even more certain. Because unlike Jack, Liam wasn't hiding his failures. He faced them honestly, shamefully, humanly. When was the last time you gambled? I asked softly. 2 years? 4 months? And your daughter? His face softened instantly. She's my whole life. I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question that mattered most. If you received money someday, what would you do first? Liam laughed weakly through obvious emotion. Pay off Ava's school tuition. Not a car, not luxury, not status. His child. That answer settled something permanently inside me. Jack saw inheritance as security for his lifestyle. Liam saw money as protection for someone he loved. That difference meant everything. You're a good man, I whispered. He shook his head immediately. No. I'm just a man trying very hard not to repeat his worst mistakes. The honesty of that sentence nearly broke me. Because truly, good people rarely describe themselves as good. They stay aware of the damage they're capable of causing. And suddenly, I understood something painful about my son, too. Jack stopped examining himself years ago. Ambition convinced him success automatically meant moral correctness. Meanwhile, Liam still carried guilt every single day. One became softer through suffering. The other became harder. And maybe that's the entire difference between wisdom and selfishness. Liam sat beside me again, eventually still visibly shaken. I can't accept your inheritance, he whispered. I smiled sadly. That's the beautiful part. He frowned slightly. What, you're the first person who didn't want it? And for the first time since this entire nightmare began? I finally felt absolutely certain about my decision. Christmas arrived cold and gray that year. Rosewood tried its best to create holiday cheer. Nurses wore reindeer headbands. Plastic wreaths hung crookedly on every door. Someone placed wrapped empty boxes beneath the lobby tree to make things feel festive. But sadness still lived in the corners of the building. You could feel it, especially among the residents whose families never came. I watched Gloria pretend not to care when her daughter canceled Christmas lunch for the third year in a row. I watched Mr. Delaney sit in the lobby, wearing a suit jacket all morning, just in case his grandson surprised him. He never came. Loneliness during the holidays feels louder somehow. Jack visited early Christmas Eve, not with Vanessa, alone. The moment I saw him walking through the entrance, carrying a cardboard bakery box, I noticed something immediately. He looked thinner. Not dramatically, just worn down, like stress had finally started eating through the polished image he worked so hard to maintain. "Merry Christmas," he said awkwardly. "Merry Christmas." He lifted the box slightly. "Pecan pie?" I blinked in surprise. "That was your father's favorite." "I know." For a second, emotion caught painfully in my throat. Because Jack remembered. Not strategically, not financially, personally. We sat together in the small lounge beside the Christmas tree while snow threatened outside the windows. Neither of us spoke much at first. Eventually, he opened the pie container carefully. "I tried making it myself," he admitted. That startled an actual laugh out of me. "You baking?" "Yeah, well." He shrugged awkwardly. "Turns out I inherited Dad's cooking skills. That poor pie never had a chance." For the first time in months, we laughed together naturally. And somehow, that hurt almost as much as the fighting had. Because moments like this reminded me what we lost. Jack cut 2 uneven slices while soft Christmas music drifted through the room. Then quietly, without looking at me, he said, "Vanessa's in the hospital." My stomach dropped instantly. "What happened?" "She started bleeding again last night." Fear swept through me immediately. "Is the baby all right?" "They think so." "Think so." The uncertainty in those words chilled me. Jack rubbed his exhausted face slowly. "They're keeping her overnight for monitoring." I reached for his hand instinctively. "How are you holding up?" The question seemed to undo him slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. "I'm tired," he admitted quietly. Really admitted it this time. Not defensive, not angry. Just honest. "I barely sleep anymore." Suddenly, I noticed details I'd overlooked before. Dark circles beneath his eyes, the tremor in his fingers, the tension permanently sitting in his shoulders. My son looked afraid, and despite everything, maternal instinct surged through me immediately. Because love doesn't disappear simply because trust breaks. That's the tragedy of family pain. "I'm sorry things are hard," I whispered. Jack stared down at his pie silently. Then suddenly, he asked, "Do you hate me?" The question cracked something open inside my chest. "No." "You should." "No," I repeated softly. "I'm hurt by you. That's different." Jack swallowed hard. "I keep replaying everything." "What things?" "The phone calls I ignored. The times I rushed you off the phone. The way I talked about the house." Shame radiated from him now. Real shame. Not fear of consequences. Understanding. "I didn't notice how bad I'd become," he whispered. Those words mattered more than apologies. Because true remorse begins when people stop defending themselves. A long silence followed. Then Jack finally said the thing I think he'd been avoiding for weeks. I was counting on that inheritance. There it was. Plain. Ugly. Honest. Surprisingly, I respected the honesty more than all the excuses. For the baby, I asked quietly. For everything. He laughed bitterly. The mortgage, medical bills, Vanessa's complications. My job might cut bonuses next year. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. I built my whole life assuming eventually there'd be security. Security. Such an innocent word for something that had caused so much damage. And when did my death become part of your financial planning? I asked softly. Jack flinched visibly. I never wanted you dead. I know. But somewhere along the way, he whispered, I think I stopped seeing you as permanent. That sentence hollowed me out completely, because it was honest. Terrible, but honest. Children forget their parents are human. Then adulthood makes them forget parents are temporary too. Jack looked toward the Christmas tree blinking quietly beside us. When Dad died, he said softly, You handled everything. I had to. You always handled everything. Suddenly, I understood part of the problem. Jack spent his whole life believing I would emotionally survive anything. Widowhood, financial hardship, loneliness, neglect, because I always had before. Strong mothers accidentally raise children who stop worrying about their pain. I should have fought harder for you, he whispered. Tears burned instantly behind my eyes. Yes, he should have. Not financially, emotionally. He should have protected me from loneliness the way I once protected him from fear. I can't undo it, he said quietly. No. That answer visibly hurt him. Good, not cruelly, truthfully. Some damage remains permanent even after regret arrives. Jack stared at the floor for several seconds. Then finally, Are you really giving everything to Liam? I nodded slowly. He exhaled heavily, but didn't argue this time. Instead, he asked something unexpected. Does he deserve it? The question surprised me. Not because of the words, because there was no bitterness in them anymore. Only sadness. Yes, I answered honestly. Jack nodded once, then very quietly. Then maybe I deserve losing it. That sentence nearly shattered me. Because for the first time, my son finally understood. This wasn't only about money. It was about character. About who remained compassionate when compassion was inconvenient. Jack leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes briefly. I used to think being successful meant never struggling again, he admitted. And now, he laughed weakly. Now I think maybe I became scared of struggle turning me into dad. I frowned slightly. Your father wasn't weak. No, Jack whispered. But after he lost the construction company, he looked broken. His voice cracked. I remember hearing you cry at night when you thought I was asleep. My breath caught painfully. I never knew he remembered that. I promised myself I'd never let my family live like that. Suddenly, everything became clearer. The obsession with control, money, security, image. Jack wasn't only greedy, he was terrified. Terrified of instability. Terrified of failing his future child. Terrified of becoming vulnerable. And fear left unchecked long enough eventually turns people selfish. I understand your fear, I whispered. Jack looked up slowly. But fear doesn't excuse cruelty. He nodded immediately. I know. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then unexpectedly, Jack smiled faintly. You know what the worst part is? What I think Liam's a better person than me? I almost argued, but instead I asked quietly, What are you going to do about that? The question seemed to settle deeply inside him. Finally, after several seconds, he answered, I don't know yet. But something about his voice told me he was finally asking himself the right questions, and maybe that mattered more than inheritance ever could. Before leaving that evening, Jack paused near the doorway. Then slowly, awkwardly, like he hadn't done it in years, he walked back and hugged me. Really hugged me. Not out of obligation, not performance. Need. His shoulders trembled slightly against mine. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. This time, I believed him. The heartbreaking part was, believing him didn't magically heal everything, but it was the first real step either of us had taken in a very long time. January arrived quietly. The holidays disappeared from Rosewood almost overnight. Nurses packed away plastic ornaments into dusty storage bins while the lobby tree vanished without ceremony. Somehow the building always felt sadder after Christmas, like everyone had briefly pretended life was warmer than it really was. But something inside me had changed. Not dramatically, not magically. Healing rarely happens that way. It happens in tiny moments people barely notice at first. Like waking up one morning and realizing you no longer check your phone every hour, hoping someone will call. Or laughing naturally, without immediately feeling guilty afterward. Or noticing sunlight again. That winter, I started noticing sunlight. Liam and Ava became part of my routine in ways that felt strangely natural. Every Wednesday after Ava's school art club, Liam brought her to Rosewood for dinner before his evening maintenance shift. Ava started calling me Miss Sienna with the kind of affection children give freely when they feel safe. One evening, she burst into my room carrying construction paper covered in glitter. "I made you something." I opened the card carefully. Inside was a crooked drawing of 3 people standing beside a house with flowers outside. One figure had gray curls, one had braids, one was much taller. Above them, in uneven child handwriting, she'd written, "Families can happen again." I nearly cried right there in front of her. Children understand emotional truths. Adults spend years avoiding. That little girl somehow saw exactly what was happening to all of us. Liam noticed my expression immediately. "You okay?" I nodded quickly. "Perfectly okay." But later that night after they left, I sat alone staring at Ava's card for almost an hour. Families can happen again. The sentence settled deep inside me. Because for months, I'd focused entirely on loss. Losing Jack emotionally, losing my home, losing trust. But somewhere along the way, life quietly gave me something too. Connection, not replacement. Nothing replaces your child. But human hearts are larger than people realize. We can grieve one relationship while still building another. That realization saved me more than anyone probably understood. Around mid-January, Gloria passed away peacefully in her sleep. Rosewood handled death with uncomfortable efficiency. By lunchtime, staff had already removed her belongings from the room. By dinner, a new resident was scheduled to arrive the following morning. That's the terrifying thing about places like Rosewood. Life keeps moving, even when hearts stop. I attended the small memorial service in the chapel, alongside maybe 6 other residents, and one exhausted-looking nephew who kept checking his watch. Gloria deserved more than that. Afterward, I sat alone in the courtyard, struggling unexpectedly with grief. Not just for Gloria, for all of us, for aging, for invisibility. Liam found me there after his shift ended. "You disappeared," he said softly. "Gloria died." His face immediately fell. "Oh." We sat in silence for a while. Then quietly, I whispered, "I'm afraid of disappearing." Liam looked toward me carefully. "You won't." "Yes, I will." I gestured toward the building behind us. "People come here to fade away." He shook his head immediately. "No," he said firmly. "People come here because society gets uncomfortable with vulnerability." The sentence stunned me. "You really believe that?" "Yes." He leaned back against the bench. Everybody loves independence until someone actually needs care. Then suddenly, patience disappears. I stared at him quietly. You think about this a lot. My mother spent her last years feeling like a burden, he admitted softly. I hate seeing that happen to other people. That ache in his voice still hadn't disappeared. Maybe it never would. And strangely enough, that made me trust him even more. People who carry grief honestly tend to become gentler with other people's pain. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Jack asked if he could take me out to lunch. Not discuss paperwork, not argue, just lunch. I almost said no. Part of me still didn't trust the timing of his emotional transformation. But another part recognized something important. If people are genuinely trying to change someone, eventually has to allow room for it. So I agreed. Jack picked me up that Saturday afternoon in silence. He looked nervous the entire drive to a small seafood restaurant near River Street downtown. The same restaurant Robert used to take us to every anniversary. That detail nearly broke my heart. You remembered, I whispered when we parked. Jack swallowed hard. I've been remembering a lot lately. Lunch was awkward at first. Painfully awkward. Like strangers trying to reconstruct a language they once spoke fluently. But slowly conversation started flowing again. Not perfectly. Carefully. He told me Vanessa's pregnancy was stabilizing. I told him about Ava's art projects. He asked about Rosewood residents by name. Actually listened to the answers. Then, halfway through lunch, he suddenly said I met Liam. I froze instantly. What, he came by the hospital to drop off paperwork for Rosewood last week. Vanessa introduced herself. Panic flickered through me immediately. What happened? Jack stared down at his coffee for several seconds. Then surprisingly, he smiled faintly. He's not what I expected. What did you expect? He laughed bitterly. Honestly, some manipulative guy trying to charm an old woman out of money? The honesty startled me, and Jack shook his head slowly. He spent 20 minutes helping an elderly volunteer carry supplies to her car in the rain. He looked up toward me, didn't even realize I was watching. Warmth spread slowly through my chest. Because Liam's kindness wasn't selective, it wasn't performance, it was character. What did you think of him? I asked carefully. Jack hesitated. Then finally, I think he actually cares about you. Hearing my son admit that felt strangely enormous. Not because it validated Liam, because it meant Jack was finally learning how to recognize genuine goodness without immediately distrusting it. Growth often begins there. Not in guilt, in recognition. After lunch, Jack drove me back to Rosewood slowly. Before I got out of the car, he stopped me gently. Mom, yes, I know I may never fully fix this. His honesty caught me off guard again. But I want you to know I'm trying. I looked at my son carefully, really looked at him. The sharp edges around him were softening slightly now. Not disappearing completely, but changing. Pain was forcing him to examine himself for the first time in years. And maybe that was the beginning of wisdom. I see that, I whispered. Jack nodded once. Then quietly, I don't expect the inheritance anymore. Those words mattered more than he realized. Because for the first time, our relationship no longer felt financially contaminated. It felt human again. Fragile, damaged, but human. That evening, Liam sat beside me in the lobby, while Ava colored nearby on the floor. You look peaceful, he said softly. I smiled faintly. I think I finally stopped fighting reality. And what reality is, that I looked at Ava laughing quietly to herself, while decorating her drawing with glitter glue. Then I looked toward the hallway, where Jack had hugged me goodbye earlier that afternoon. That families don't always heal perfectly, I whispered. Sometimes they heal differently. Liam studied me carefully, and that's enough. I thought about it for a long moment. Then slowly, honestly, it's becoming enough. And for the first time in nearly a year, I truly meant it. By February, something unusual started happening. Jack began volunteering at Rosewood. The first time he showed up carrying donated books and coffee for residents, half the staff looked shocked. Honestly, so did I. He stood awkwardly in the lobby wearing jeans instead of expensive business clothes, looking completely out of place beside wheelchairs and bingo flyers. "What are you doing here?" I asked carefully. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Helping, hopefully." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "You hate places like this." The honesty of the statement made him wince. "I know." That answer alone told me something had changed. Old Jack would have defended himself immediately. This version listened first. At first, the residents distrusted him. Rightfully. People who abandon vulnerability often become uncomfortable around it afterward. And elderly people can sense insincerity faster than most. But Jack kept coming back, week after week. No cameras, no announcements, no dramatic speeches about redemption. Just small things. He repaired broken reading lamps, organized transportation for residents without family, helped staff move furniture during renovations. One afternoon, I watched him sit beside Mr. Delaney for almost an hour, listening patiently to repeated war stories he'd already heard 3 times. That mattered, because patience reveals character more than grand gestures ever will. Liam noticed the changes too. "He's trying," he admitted one evening while helping Ava with homework in the lobby. "I know." "You trust it," I thought carefully before answering. "Not completely yet." Liam nodded slowly. "That's fair." Then after a pause, he added quietly, "But people can become different versions of themselves." The sentence lingered heavily between us, because Liam understood transformation better than most people. He rebuilt himself after addiction, after guilt, after loss. Maybe that's why he could recognize genuine effort in Jack now, without ignoring the damage already done. One Saturday morning, I arrived early to the activity room and found Jack alone, setting up chairs for a residents' breakfast fundraiser. He looked exhausted, again, but differently now. Not hollow the way he'd looked months earlier. Grounded, like struggle was finally reconnecting him to humanity instead of driving him away from it. "You don't have to keep proving yourself," I told him quietly. He looked up from the folding chairs. "I'm not." I raised an eyebrow. No. He exhaled heavily. "I'm trying to learn how to stop centering my own comfort all the time." The honesty startled me again. "When did you become this self-aware?" Jack laughed weakly. "Probably around the time I realized a maintenance worker had more integrity than me." I almost smiled. That humility mattered. Because real growth begins the moment people stop protecting their ego from truth. Jack finished arranging chairs before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad." Something in his voice shifted when he said it. Softer. More vulnerable. "He would have hated what I became," he admitted quietly. Pain spread slowly through my chest. "Your father loved you." "I know." Jack swallowed hard, but he respected kindness more than success. Yes, Robert Hamilton had always measured people differently. He didn't care about status, or money, or appearances. He cared about how people treated those with nothing to offer them. And somewhere along the way, Jack forgot that lesson completely. "What changed you?" I asked softly. Jack stared down at the chair in his hands. Then finally, fear. That answer came immediately now. No excuses, no deflection, just truth. I spent so many years terrified of becoming financially unstable that I slowly started valuing people based on usefulness. His voice cracked slightly, and I did it to my own mother. The grief in his face felt genuine now, not performative, not self-pitying. Awareness. Sometimes awareness hurts more than punishment. A few weeks later, something happened that changed everything for Jack permanently. Rosewood organized a community outreach program pairing volunteers with elderly residents who had no visitors. Jack signed up reluctantly after one of the nurses pressured him into helping. That's how he met Eleanor Price. Eleanor was 87 years old, nearly blind, and had advanced arthritis in both hands. Her only son lived in California and hadn't visited in almost 4 years. At first, Jack only planned to help her organize old photo albums. Instead, he became emotionally attached to her almost immediately. Maybe because Eleanor reminded him of me. Or maybe because guilt makes people suddenly sensitive to pain they once ignored. Every Thursday afternoon, Jack sat with Eleanor while she told stories about raising children during the 60s. One evening, I overheard him laughing with her in the courtyard. Real laughter. Warm laughter. The kind I hadn't heard from him in years. Then one rainy afternoon, Eleanor suffered a stroke. Jack was there when it happened. He rode in the ambulance beside her because no family could be reached immediately. He stayed at the hospital for 12 hours. When he returned to Rosewood the next morning, he looked shattered. "She kept asking for her son," he whispered to me later. My heart broke instantly. Jack sat heavily beside me in the lobby. And he never came. Tears filled his eyes suddenly. I kept thinking, what if that had been you? There it was. The emotional understanding he'd been slowly approaching for months finally crashed into him completely. Not intellectually, viscerally. For the first time, my son truly understood abandonment from the inside. "I was so sure I had time," he whispered. I reached for his hand, quietly. "So many people think that." Jack covered his face briefly. She looked terrified. The sentence came out broken. And suddenly, I realized something important. Empathy had finally become personal for him. Not theoretical, not moral. Real. Painfully real. A few days later, Jack did something I never expected. He sold his luxury SUV. When I found out, I stared at him in disbelief. "You loved that ridiculous car." He laughed softly. "Yeah. Why sell it?" He shrugged. "Rosewood needs better wheelchair ramps." I blinked. "What?" The administrator mentioned funding problems. My throat tightened instantly. "You sold your car for that?" Jack looked embarrassed suddenly. It was excessive anyway. "No, it wasn't about the car. It was about priorities. For the first time in years, my son was choosing compassion over appearance, and somehow that mattered more to me than the inheritance issue ever had." One evening, Liam pulled me aside near the nurse's station. "You know something. What I think your son's becoming a good man again." Emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat. Again, Liam smiled faintly. "People don't transform into kindness from nothing, Sienna." He glanced toward Jack, helping a resident adjust her walker across the hallway. "Usually it means kindness existed before. They just lost their way somewhere." Tears burned instantly behind my eyes, because maybe that was true. Maybe I'd spent so long grieving who Jack became that I forgot growth was still possible. Not guaranteed. Possible. Later that night, Jack walked me back to my room after dinner. Before leaving, he hesitated awkwardly in the doorway. "Mom, yes, if you never change the will back?" I waited quietly. "I'll understand." The words sounded painful, but peaceful too. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed him completely. Because somewhere between guilt and humility, My son had finally learned the difference between deserving love and earning trust. Spring arrived gently in Savannah. The oak trees outside Rosewood bloomed green again, and sunlight started lingering longer across the courtyard benches in the evenings. Residents who had hidden indoors all winter slowly returned outside, wrapped in light sweaters and blankets. Everything felt softer somehow. Even me. One morning in April, I stood beside the courtyard garden holding Ava's small hand, while she proudly showed me tiny lavender flowers beginning to bloom in the clay pot Liam had given me months earlier. "See," she said excitedly. "They survived." I smiled down at her. "Yes," I whispered. "They did." The words felt bigger than flowers, because survival had become the theme of all our lives. Jack survived becoming someone he didn't recognize. Liam survived grief and addiction. I survived abandonment. And somehow, against all odds, we had all found our way toward something gentler afterward. Not perfect, never perfect, but honest. That afternoon, Harold Bennett arrived at Rosewood carrying the same worn leather briefcase he always carried. He moved slower these days, but his eyes still missed nothing. "You look happier," he observed while sitting across from me in the courtyard. "I think I am." He smiled faintly. "That's good." For a few moments, we simply watched Ava chase bubbles nearby, while Liam pretended dramatic defeat every time one popped against his shoulder. Then, Harold opened the briefcase carefully. "I assume you know why I'm here." I nodded slowly. "The final estate documents. The last decision." Months earlier, I had imagined this moment filled with anger and satisfaction. I thought revenge would feel powerful. Instead, I felt calm. That surprised me most of all. Harold adjusted his glasses. "You can still revise everything." I looked toward the courtyard. Jack sat nearby helping Gloria's old friend Margaret untangle knitting yarn, while patiently listening to a story he'd probably already heard 3 times. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. The sight tightened something emotional in my chest. Growth changes people quietly, not through dramatic speeches, through repeated acts of care. "I've thought about it carefully," I said softly. Harold nodded once, and I smiled faintly. "Liam stays in the will." Harold didn't look surprised, but then I continued. "So does Jack." That finally startled him. "Equal shares." I shook my head slowly. "No." The breeze moved gently through the courtyard while Ava laughed nearby. "Liam receives the house," I said quietly. "And enough financial support to guarantee Ava's future." Harold wrote carefully. "And your son?" I looked toward Jack again. "He receives the remainder of the investment accounts." Harold paused. "That's still substantial?" "Yes." "You're certain?" I smiled sadly. This stopped being about punishment a long time ago. That was the truth. Months earlier, I wanted Jack to hurt the way I hurt. But pain alone rarely changes people. Love combined with consequences does. Jack needed to lose something important to understand what he'd become. But he didn't need to lose everything forever. Harold closed the folder slowly. "You know," he said quietly, "most families never recover from situations like this." I looked down at my hands. We almost didn't. That evening, I asked Jack and Liam to meet me in the courtyard after dinner. Both looked confused immediately, especially when Harold appeared carrying paperwork. "What's going on?" Jack asked cautiously. I took a slow breath. Then finally, I finalized the estate. The tension that passed between them was immediate. Liam looked deeply uncomfortable. Jack looked pale. I held up a hand gently before either could speak. "Please, just listen." The courtyard was quiet except for distant birdsong and the soft fountain nearby. "I spent months believing this story was about betrayal," I said slowly. "And maybe part of it was. Jack lowered his eyes immediately. But somewhere along the way, I realized something important. I looked toward Liam. Kindness matters. Then toward Jack. And so does accountability. Neither man spoke. "I'm leaving the Savannah house to Liam." Jack inhaled sharply, but stayed silent. "Along with educational support for Ava." Liam looked horrified immediately. "Sienna?" "No," I said gently. "Please let me finish." His eyes filled instantly with emotion. Then I turned toward my son. "The remaining estate will go to Jack." Jack stared at me in disbelief. "What you heard me?" His face completely crumbled. "Mom, you were wrong," I whispered softly. "Deeply wrong. But you faced it eventually." Tears burned suddenly in his eyes. "I don't deserve that." "No," I answered honestly. "Maybe not." The truth of that sentence hit all of us hard. But punishment wasn't healing me anymore. I continued quietly. "Watching you become compassionate again did." Jack covered his face briefly, visibly overwhelmed. Liam looked stunned into silence beside him. "I didn't choose between you," I said softly. "I chose what each of you represented during the hardest period of my life." I looked at Liam. "You reminded me human goodness still exists." Then Jack. "And you reminded me people can change if they're willing to confront themselves honestly." For several long moments, nobody spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Liam shook his head weakly. "I still don't know how to accept any of this." I smiled faintly. "That's why you should." He laughed, through visible emotion. Jack wiped at his eyes roughly before finally speaking. "I'm sorry for every moment I made you feel alone." The sincerity in his voice settled deep inside my chest. Not because apologies erase damage, because accountability finally lived inside him now. I reached for his hand gently. "Then don't repeat it with your child." That sentence broke him completely. Jack cried openly for the first time since Robert's funeral. And strangely enough, watching my grown son finally collapse emotionally didn't feel victorious. It felt human. A few weeks later, Vanessa gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Jack named her Grace Hamilton. When he placed her carefully into my arms for the first time, something inside me healed in a place I thought was permanently broken. "She has your eyes," I whispered. Jack smiled weakly. I was hoping she would. Liam and Ava visited the hospital later, carrying flowers and balloons. Watching all of us standing together in that small room felt surreal somehow. Messy, unconventional, beautiful. Life rarely rebuilds families exactly the way they existed before. Sometimes it builds entirely new versions instead. Months later, after I officially moved out of Rosewood and into a small, renovated guest cottage behind the old Savannah house, people often asked whether I regretted everything that happened. Honestly, no. Because losing the illusion of unconditional family loyalty forced all of us to become more truthful. Jack became kinder. Liam became hopeful again. And I finally learned something women my age are rarely taught. Your worth does not disappear just because someone fails to value you properly. Not even your own child. Especially not your own child. Some evenings, all of us gather together now beneath the old oak tree behind the house, while Ava chases Grace across the grass. Jack grills terrible barbecue exactly like Robert used to. Liam laughs louder than everyone else, and sometimes I sit quietly watching them while lavender blooms nearby in the warm Georgia air. Families can happen again. Just not always the way you expected. Sometimes the deepest heartbreak in life doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people we once believed would never hurt us. Children grow up, parents grow older, and somewhere in between, love can slowly become distracted by stress, money, fear, and pride. But this story was never truly about inheritance. It was about what happens when people stop seeing each other clearly. Sienna didn't need millions of dollars to feel valuable. She needed dignity. She needed to feel remembered, seen, loved. And in the darkest season of her life, it was a stranger who reminded her that kindness still exists in the world. But this story is also about something equally important people can change when they finally face the truth about themselves. Jack made terrible mistakes. He allowed fear and ambition to harden his heart. Yet real growth began the moment he stopped defending his actions and started understanding the pain he caused. That's a lesson many people never learn. Life has a way of humbling all of us eventually. Money fades, pride fades, beauty fades, but the way we treat people, especially those who loved us when we had nothing, stays behind long after everything else disappears. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's this: never wait until someone is lonely to show them love. Never assume you'll always have more time, and never measure a person's worth by what they can still do for you. Sometimes family is the one you're born into. Sometimes family is the person who stays when they have no reason to. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced betrayal forgiveness or a second chance in your own family? Share your story down in the comments. And if you're listening from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love reading your messages. And if stories like this remind you that compassion still matters, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more emotional journeys like this one.